Hi there, everybody. We're just going to wait for it to fill up a bit more, and then we'll get started in about 10-20 seconds or so. Oh, could somebody just write in the chat box if they can hear us okay? Just do a bit of a sound check. Perfect. Perfect. Okay, we've got quite a few people in there. I'm sure people will filter in as well. Yeah, so thanks everybody for joining us this evening. We've got Steve Miller back again to deliver another presentation. This time it's on calf rehabilitation. So just a huge thank you for Steve for giving up your time this evening. For those of you who don't know Steve, he's worked in professional sport for over 10 years and recently set up his own company called Physio, which he can sort of tell you a little bit about in a second. And just wanted to remind you guys, we've obviously got quite a few webinars coming up. We've got one next week, and Steve's actually joining us on that as well, and that's with former Chelsea and England physio Dave Hancock. So we'll send out all the information on that. So just check our socials and the emails just so you don't miss out on that. And then this evening after the presentation, we'll do the Q&A. So put the questions in the Q&A box, just to reiterate, not the chat box, but the Q&A box so we don't miss it. And then we'll go through the questions at the end. But even if you've got a question from like the first and second slide, just keep popping them in and we can reference back. And just as a final note from me, if you do take a picture or share any of the information today, just bear in mind we'll be using one of the athletes from, I think it's Newcastle Falcons. So just don't take too much, don't take pictures or anything of those specific slides, because we're just, he's given consent for us to use them for a closed webinar, but we don't really want to be sharing it out to social. Cool, so Steve, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've got to start really by saying again, a massive thank you to Charlie and the team at Physique for letting me talk again here. I think it's a great platform, and I'm so glad we're giving you an opportunity to access really good quality CPD. Now, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a background regarding what Grow Physio is and where it came from. Now, I've always been somebody who believes that you should have access to professional sport, but unfortunately, we've rarely had the opportunity to offer placements. We've sometimes given people some access to academy setups, but really the world of pro sport is fairly limited. And then in around June time, obviously in the midst of the pandemic, I spoke to some friends who work in lecturing worlds, and they were all struggling to A, sort of put material together, and B, obviously find placements for students to go out and get some practical experience. And I sort of said to them, well, what can I do to help? And I started putting together some of the webinar bits and pieces that you may have seen sort of in the November last year, where we're going through sort of case studies, because I had so much footage of some of the players, and the players were really good at giving consent for us to use them as part of an educational platform. But actually, I think the whole process is far more advanced, and there's so many more factors to that, really. So what I wanted to do is almost build on that and almost go through the whole step-by-step process. So through lockdown, in between sort of clinics being a little bit quieter, I've gone and put together a platform that you can all use. It goes through the theory, which I've called the roots, the assessment side of things, practicals to sort of differentiate bits and pieces, the treatment. I'm a massive advocate for manual therapy and strapping in all the little bits that unfortunately seem to be quicksanding away into existence. And then obviously the rehab side of things, which we're going to go through here. And then the case study almost sort of pulls everything together. So obviously the calf elements that we're going to go through here, the focus is on management of a gastrocnemius versus a soleus. The ankle one, the ankle course that we've got there, has far more of a proprioceptive balance element to it. And the hamstring strand to the rehab really builds that athlete for those high speed sprint meters, really. So it gives good practical examples. Now, it costs £1 to access it for the first 30 days. It does roll on, but I don't mind if you want to let it roll on or not. Please use it. Please use it as a really good resource. I've had a great time putting it all together. It's actually paid off that I've got students now coming in to use the platform to offer sort of 40 hours worth of their virtual placements, which we're offering in a couple of weeks. And I hope that you guys really benefit from the teaching tonight. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to tap off. So I'm going to play the recording, which is a recording from the website. I hope you enjoy it, and then we'll come back again at the end really to do a Q&A. Okay, hi everybody, and welcome back to Grow Physio. So in this section, what we're going to look at is trying to bring together everything that we've gone through in terms of the theory, the assessment, some of the treatment interventions, and how that then applies into building this athlete up from a rehabilitation perspective. So again, the focus is going to be on that gastrocnemius versus your soleus. They are not working against each other, quite the opposite, they work together. However, it's really important, I feel, to emphasize the difference in the approaches and the management strategies right the way through that journey. So what are we going to look at? So we'll look at the subjective and the objective very quickly and just recap on some of the findings that we may well look at, and how that looks at giving us a classification and a diagnosis that we can work with so we can assign timescales appropriately. We'll look at, again, interventions slightly, and when we look at dripping those in. So during a loading process, we may well need to do a little bit of work just to address some of the changes and the work that goes through these calves, because at times there's clearly going to be need to maybe just reduce some tone and just calm that tissue down. That doesn't mean that you've irritated anything, but it may help, it may restore some objective markers when you do that. We will look initially at some of the reduced capacity loading options. So we try and make all rehab as functional as we can. And then again, for the athlete, for that buy-in, it's really important that they can see how what they're doing applies to how they're going to be and how that integrates them into their appropriate sport. We'll look at rehab progressions. And again, it's really important to always have a progression and a regression to each exercise. So you can quite quickly adapt where that athlete is and give them something that's a little bit more challenging, or actually go the other way and maybe give them something that's a little easier to do. We'll then, in the second half of this, so the late stage elements, and that's where we'll focus on the return to sport. So this is a two-part process. This is the early and moderate sort of loading, which again might be enough for some individuals, but actually that later stage reintegration into sport there and back into running, that's covered in the next stage as well. And as ever, we'll have a little reflect at half time and talk about what we've gone through. So your diagnosis is really, really important. So that is going to help you guide whether it is a gastrocnemius tear, if it's a soleus tear, and some of the little clues that you'll get. And again, just to highlight, a gastrocnemius tear, very much like a hamstring, you're normally aware of it almost immediately that you've torn it, whereas some of your soleus issues tend to grumble on. They might feel tight. They just don't feel like they can perform. And actually, it might be after the sort of game or training session or running drills that they actually come in and say, oh, actually, I'm aware of this. It just didn't seem to release off, and it just continued feeling tight. If you've got the opportunity to build in some imaging, so if you've got MRI available, again, the marrying up of your clinical findings into that MRI, again, will give you a good diagnosis and classification. And the importance of knowing whether it's your gastroc or your soleus is really important, because the build-ups for this during rehabilitation, in particular in this module, look very different. And I think this is something that I've built over time, where a calf tear, you can't manage a gastrocnemius the same as a soleus and always end up with good positive results. They're very different. So your gastrocnemius, if we go very simplistic, it's a very linear build-up. So we take them through the gym phases, the sort of early introduction to some low-speed running, build them into sort of moderate speed, high speed, and so on. Whereas your soleus doesn't seem to like any of that sort of low-level running stuff at all. So over time, what I've learned to do is really work on building that athlete up in a gym environment, doing some of your dynamic isometric work we'll talk about, and then dripping them into running at a higher level. In terms of load modification, this is something that you may want to deload locally. So it might be that someone has had a tear and actually they don't like it being put on stretch. So things like your heel raises or orthotics and things are useful. Again, you might need to shift things down to an isometric or change the range that you're working in. And then again, looking at all your things like GPS data, if you have that available, just thinking about time on feet and what has maybe sort of predisposed that athlete. What do they need to get back to? Because fundamentally, where they are now to where they need to get to is the most important thing. The management, again, during this loading process, which is the sort of prime thing with calf rehab, there's likely to be a lot of load going through these calves. And at times, the athlete may feel that they need a little bit of input just to help manage symptoms, restore objective markers, and get them back to a sort of less risky position. The return to play timescales are really important to note as well. So with the same size of tear, you may be looking at a soleus taking 2, maybe even 3 times longer than a gastrocnemius. You often find that there's a lot more clues that things aren't, that your gastrocnemius isn't happy, whereas with your soleus, again, it kind of grumbles on a little bit, feels quite tight, and then actually it then ends up sort of breaking down. So that feedback that you get through this journey from your athlete, really important. And that should hopefully allow you to go through that process fairly nicely. The principles are similar. You're going from an isometric into a more dynamic isometric load, into your plyometrics, and then reintegrate the athlete. And it's really important to not forget those 2 latter stages, because if you don't address them, the likelihood is you haven't prepared that athlete appropriately. So what can influence the initial tear, or what may the athlete be exposed to? And actually, there's some really good literature coming out talking about the first thing. So sleep is really important. So the difference, again, between an athlete who's maybe got a normal sort of healthy sleep pattern in terms of the number of hours, if we take that, so someone who has maybe 5 hours worth of sleep and increasing that to sort of 7.5 hours sleep actually reduces their injury risk in some of the studies by 4.5 times. So again, stress related things, it's not just physical stress, it might be psychological stress, things that are going on within that athlete's life away from the club or the training environment that you need to consider as well. The diet and the nutrition, another really important part of that recovery and building process we need to get right. The acute to chronic load ratios that have been discussed, so almost having a spike initially and then that almost starting to come out in the woodwork a few weeks later, if not immediately. Again, trying to make sure we've got a constant load going through and keeping players playing seems to be a really important factor in terms of their injury prevention. Now, stiffness, just to touch on again, this isn't always that sort of ankle stiffness where you've got a reduced range of motion. This might actually be something that we sort of look for in a positive sense in terms of the tendon. So we're trying to develop some stiffness through that calf and tendon region. And by that, what we end up doing is almost creating a better platform and foundation that athlete can build off. So when they land, if they are landing onto, say, a 4-foot, if they're a 4-foot runner, that ability for them to stick that position and not drop into that dorsiflex position and then have to spring out of that reduces the load on that Achilles and calf considerably, as well as everything through the foot and that sort of windlass mechanism. Injury history is important, so we need to obviously bear in mind that there may be things that have predisposed this athlete, and that should be built into their rehabilitation as well. The training surface, be it grass, artificial, might be that it's actually sort of a greasy surface. Again, these little elements all have different impact on the ground contact time and how that calf is loaded. So we need to prepare the athlete potentially for that. There's things that we can't control often, like the sort of fixture lists, and it might be that we have periods where there's a lot of games in a short space of time, and that has a massive impact on the sort of acute load for that athlete. But we need to, again, build in all of the different elements of recovery, much like we would in a season, into that rehab program as well. Footwear might be a factor. So they might be in boots versus trainers. They might have changed something, and that might have predisposed them as well. So all these other little factors are worth considering with your athletes. So what might we do initially? So it might be that actually this athlete has a fundamental sort of weakness that we can't correct. So in those sort of situations, we may look at sort of getting something to support that athlete in certain foot positions, and orthotics are a really useful adjunct to this. So far out of my scope of practice, really, this is why we've got podiatrists and sports mechanists, really. What we're looking at doing is giving that athlete something that either sort of corrects the foot position and encourages some load in certain ways, or actually the opposite, deloads that anatomical structure so they can actually function better. And again, you might get much better bang for your buck if you're doing that with an athlete during your rehab process. If we think about the best positions to analyze that in, so I think probably what is done too often is clinicians look at the static position of a foot or what they're doing in an isometric position and not addressing the dynamic component and how that athlete is in walking or running, multi-directional activities. So again, that needs to form part of our rehabilitation process, because they might look great in a linear fashion, but as soon as we go multi-plane with them, then it starts to expose some weaknesses and less efficient patterns. You can do things yourself that are very simple with that, like looking at that athlete on a treadmill and recording it. So maybe download an app that something like Dartfish is something that I use, and you just put that at the level of the foot. And again, just see what happens in different trainers at different speeds and what's happening with that athlete. Someone might look great at high speed and look dreadful at low speed, and vice versa, really. So again, little clues that you can get are really useful for that. Other things before you go down the rehab route is almost just making sure that they don't have anything else that massively impacts on that sort of Achilles and calf complex. So for example, if we take the windlass mechanism where we have that lovely sort of elastic energy store, so as that athlete loads onto ideally the heel, rolls in a normal sort of efficient fashion onto that sort of first MTPJ and then pushes off. If there is an issue with that first ray and there's reduced movement, or the opposite where there's maybe sort of too much movement or irritation to the capsule, like in a turf toe situation, you might well get a massive shift in load onto the calf. So it might be that actually what we need to do is almost mobilize or stabilize that joint. So that's just demonstrated here. So on the left-hand side, you've got that hypermobile first ray, first sort of metatarsopharyngeal joint. And again, if that is stirred up, there may be less comfortable loading that if there's capsular irritation. And what you may need to do is sort of stabilize that with some taping or some sort of strengthening work around there. They're the ones that often present with these sort of bunion formations if there's a little bit of a sort of angulation to that foot. And by contrast, if you've got your hypomobile joint there, you might need to encourage the mobility so they can actually transfer that load from the calf through the ankle, through the foot, and into that sort of first ray. And the other things just to, before you embark on your journey down a rehab route, really, is just to check that there's no sort of neurodynamic or neural involvement, really, with their symptoms. Because if you go down a route potentially just purely looking at the soft tissue side of things, so you might have a tear that's confirmed on imaging. Actually, if you only address the soft tissue and don't look at the neural factors, either proximally around that sort of lumbar pelvic region or anywhere through that sort of root of the sciatic nerve, again, you may well find that it starts to reoccur or you have issues. So this just shows, again, little sort of techniques that you may use, much more detail in the treatment section, but you can do some cordad massage, try and encourage that sort of axoplasmic flow, get your straight leg raise and your slump better. And you may need to, again, use things like your sliders, gliders, and tensioners potentially to help encourage that neural flow. Lots of questions about stretching. I would say if someone has a calf tear or tendon pathology, it's generally a no that we would ever do any static, prolonged release work. It doesn't mean that you may do a little bit around where the tear is, so never directly release anything over the tear site, but certainly in those sort of acute phases, you might find that maybe sort of, or in those subacute phases, chronic phases, parts of that muscle belly might well get quite tight. So actually we do have the option to do some almost manual therapy-based release work, but I'd steer clear of stretching. And the reason being, if we think of it as sort of your tendon and calf really as an energy store and a sort of coiled spring really. So on the left-hand side there, you can see coiled spring. If you stretch that, you reduce that sort of energy and stiffness that's held within that spring. Also, if you've got a tear and you are just separating the fibers, it's going to be quite painful and actually counterintuitive to that healing process. So that nice homeostasis that we look for with a healing tendon and encouraging load incrementally in a safe fashion, we maybe sort of do the opposite with stretching. And again, stiffness is a key part of that. So that stiffness that we can build through the calf and Achilles helps to reduce the ground contact time and the efficiency of movement of that athlete. And when we load and look at stiffness, it might be that we need to look at different ranges of motion that we are working in. So actually for a calf and an Achilles in particular, injuries may well have occurred in that outer range of dorsiflexion. So really important to not neglect that position and make sure we've got all of that isometric and eccentric control as strong as it should be in those outer ranges. And that can have a really positive effect on sort of sarcomere concentrations. So rehabilitation aims and principles. So these are fairly generic. So promote early tissue healing, restore contractile properties, develop force capacity in the muscle tendon unit, develop tendon mechanical properties, develop that lower limb stiffness, and maintain and develop that cardiovascular fitness as well. So that's a really important area that you need to sort of adapt. You might be doing things in a seated position. You might be doing some of your sort of rope related work, seated ski ergs, maybe hand bikes, anything that you're doing in those early phases so they don't drop off a cliff cardiovascularly. Now, depending on the sort of audience that we've got here, really, so there's different types of muscle contractions. And again, I think probably one of the key areas that I've built on is that sort of isometric loading process. So isometrics during university for me, as I was taught, was almost just pushing into a TheraBand and maintaining a sort of static position. It's really important for that dynamic stiffness that you have that really high level and high load capacity to enable that athlete to push off and almost create a stable base. We know that it can have a real positive factor in terms of hypertrophy as well. And actually some of the higher loads or the prolonged holds can certainly have a great impact in terms of developing that calf strength as well. Again, if we look at sort of increased benefits of doing isometrics, we can improve that physiological cross-sectional area. And again, thinking about the outer range, their sort of longer fascicle lengths and that rate of force development. Concentric contraction. So if we imagine a calf, again, it's that sort of heel raising motion. We need to think about sort of increased pennation angle. Again, you can get changes to the cross-sectional area, really important in terms of building a calf that can cope with the loads that are demanded with a running athlete. Eccentrically, long time we've known about sort of eccentric benefits, the increase in the sort of fascicle length, the stiffness, and that sort of extracellular muscle adaptation that we can get that's really important in that rehab process, really. Now, it's quite an interesting topic, really, in terms of eccentric load, because I think that there's a bit of a missed trick, really, in terms of how long we perform that eccentric loading process for. So actually, When we do it, we often talk about 3 seconds up, 3-second hold, 3 seconds down. It might be with some of the evidence that's evolving around isometric load in those longer, prolonged holds, that actually we could translate that and transfer it into that eccentric load. So actually make those eccentric repetitions much longer lasting. So it might be that we end up doing almost a 10-second up, 10-second hold, 10-second down sort of process. But it's probably not an area that has been evolved, but something that will be a really interesting topic. So some of the problems that tend to occur with recurrent athletes is during their rehab, they've maybe not gone heavy enough. So has there been enough sufficient load? Have they developed that tendon stiffness? And is there enough hypertrophy? And quite often, if the athlete presents and they've had problems before, doing like a circumferential test and looking at the output of that calf versus the sort of measurements of the bulk itself in that mid-belly, they may well throw up little issues that they've never restored that sort of calf strength and bulk. Have they held the contraction long enough? So a lot of evidence suggesting sort of 30 to 60 seconds now might actually be what you need to make changes in the tendon. And actually, why is that not applicable into the muscle itself? Has it been specific enough? So we need to target really, have we replicated what that athlete is going to do within their sport? So have we recreated the rate of force development and the demands that that sport and that position requires? Is it stiff enough? Again, this is where I mentioned about that sort of 30-second eccentric. Sounds like ages, but actually some of the evidence we'll talk about later suggests that the slower the hold, the more benefit we have. And it might be that we don't go through full range. We maybe just go either side of sort of neutral. But again, seems to make sense to me that actually doing an increased load has many benefits. And is it specific enough? So that athlete will move in a certain way that they've developed over their careers. And actually, everybody's unique. You will have some athletes who look, as I mentioned, sort of amazing at top speed. We had an athlete who looked absolutely horrendous until he got to about sort of 7 meters a second. And then beyond there looked like an amazing, sort of graceful, really efficient mover. But actually, it was a real challenge when we try and rehab him, because when we start to build him into some of the lower level running, he looks awful, looks very clumsy, and it's almost a little bit of a grenade until we get to those higher speeds. So you may need to adapt what you're doing in a gym setting to cater for that. And the other factor with this is it early enough? So some really good evidence to suggest that actually if we can get the athlete loading again after sort of a couple of days versus 9 days, that can have a massive difference in terms of the return to play time of that athlete. So, for example, if you've got a grade 2 gastrocnemius tear and you start to load it early doors from that day 2 mark versus day 9, again, you might be returning that athlete at sort of 10 days, 10 days maybe for like a grade 1 or sort of up to 14 days for a grade 1 versus maybe actually it taking sort of up to 4 weeks to get that athlete back if you don't load them early enough. So these are a couple of examples. So this professional rugby player here, he is just loading up by pressing into that core ball and working in a comfortable range for him. Really useful. He can then vary the amount of pressure that he's performing and pressing into the ball. And similarly, he can control the range of motion that he's going through. The other things he can do is just adapt very sort of common exercises as we are here. Looking at, again, just forefoot loading. This athlete's going through the concentric and eccentric and isometric phases. But actually, it might be that you just ask that athlete to stick in an isometric position. You can do that in different ways. So you might well have that athlete doing that double leg to reduce the amount of load. You might have them with their feet on the wall, doing a bridge with their feet up against the wall, but onto their forefoot. And you might go a double leg into a sort of split stance, into a sort of single leg motions as well. A really useful adjunct to rehab, particularly in the acute phases and subacute phases, is blood flow restriction. So you can see the cuffs that are around this athlete just above the level of that sort of gastroc. And what it's doing is almost applying a circumferential pressure that actually creates like an occluded area. So we're getting less oxygen basically pumping through that calf, so we can get the DOMS benefits without actually loading that athlete up. So you'll see that they've got dumbbells on their knees. You can vary the weight of that dumbbell. You might not even have any dumbbell on there at all. But what we would typically sort of see is this sort of 30 seconds on, 30 seconds on, 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off, 15 seconds on sort of protocols really. Or we're doing repetitions of 30 repetitions at that level, 15 repetitions, then another 15 repetitions, and then another 15 repetitions. So there's different ways that you can load it. It doesn't have to be in this position. Loads of other different ways that you can load it. You can load it in a body weight position. There's no reason why not. But while they have reduced capacity, you may need to adapt what you're doing. You could even stick them on during a sort of watt bike session or a sort of cycling session that somebody has. And again, by reducing the oxygen flow to the calf, you may well get some really useful benefits. They do say try not to do sort of more than 7 minutes of it in total with a cuff on, without sort of taking it off for a good sort of 5 to 10 minute period. And to be honest, that's normally enough for the athlete anyway. Some other ways that you can deload the athlete, clearly the pool is a really useful option. You can benefit from the sort of shallow end, the deep end. Obviously, the deeper they go, the less body weight they have going through that calf and Achilles. You get all the hydrostatic pressure benefits, and you can actually do lots of other different things with that. So you might well find that you can do tiptoe raises, tiptoeing calf raises. You might want to do some drills like your A skips, your B skips, or even get that athlete jogging if they're able to in a pool first of all. To deload the athlete even further, what you might decide to do is actually use the side of the pool, so they're using their upper limbs to further deload that athlete. The central picture here is the Alter G, which is an anti-gravity treadmill. And again, what it does is you can specify how much body weight percentage you're putting through that athlete. So they're in a bit of a chamber that's inflated. And again, what you're looking at are things like the control, the height of the calf raise. And if there's any discrepancies and things, it's a really useful option because it often has a little window in the back. You may well, again, on the Alter G, do some gait re-education in a reduced load position. So you can normally apply anything from 40% to 100% load through that athlete using an Alter G. So really useful ways to, again, build in some of the gains that you've maybe made in terms of maybe manual therapy things like your sort of windlass mechanisms, just so they get used to loading appropriately through there. And make sure, again, that they're confident doing that. So in this reduced body weight position, the athlete may well avoid overloading the opposite side, the sort of non-injured limb, if you like, and they may feel a little bit more comfortable going on that 50% to 50% weight distribution in that position. So this is the reformer. So some of our athletes used a great place local to us, sort of a Infinite Pilates, where we use sort of the coaches there to build in some of this sort of introduction to impact work and get them loading through that calf and Achilles complex. So what it is it's a sliding platform really attached onto some bungee cords, and you can vary the load going through that. So you can see here we're almost starting to try and mimic with this athlete the sort of scrum tackling position that's quite appropriate for him. So it's, again, functionally relevant for that athlete. This one, again, getting them to fire their glute and make sure that they don't lose that drop and they maintain that stickability of that calf and that heel isn't dropping during this. So they're getting that stiffness built up. These two sort of drills here, you can see on the right-hand side, the isometric loading process that we go through. So these are something that I would normally use for an Achilles issue with some of the protocols, but actually very relevant for a calf loading process, where we don't just load the athlete in a neutral position. We actually almost imagine it like a clock face, where we are almost loading them from, if 12 o'clock is the foot straight and the ankle in neutral, if we rotate that sort of lower foot round to 10 o'clock, to 11 o'clock, to 12 o'clock, to 1 o'clock, to 2 o'clock on a clock face, what we end up with doing is almost holding that load there. So as you can see there, I'm just showing this athlete the different angles that we want to carry that out with. So as they rotate, what they're doing is just sticking in various different angles. So then she's off to sort of 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock in that position. You might want to hold each one of those anywhere from sort of 6 seconds to 12 seconds. But again, you're just repeating that motion. And then we do that before any of this sort of loading later on. Now, a really important factor is that during sort of gait and walking, obviously the ground contact time that we have can vary depending on the speed of that athlete. So it might be that there's little cues that translate into running from this. So the cadence, so trying to increase the number of steps that we have. So we're reducing the stride distance that they have, running lighter. All these things that reduce the ground contact time seem to have quite a significant impact. So actually, when we get them walking, it might be that instead of getting them walking at a really slow pace, we actually need to increase the pace for something like a Soleus to avoid too much ground contact time. Incline treadmill work. So when we return an athlete, particularly a Soleus, what we may find is that the actual load capacity and the endurance of that muscle is significantly reduced. So we used to spend a lot of time with athletes just walking on an incline. So they'd set up their little documentaries or whatever it was that they were watching on Netflix and almost just go through a process for sort of up to sort of 45 minutes of just walking. Because in these limited phases where we don't want to do anything explosive, we don't want that capacity and endurance of that muscle to fail on us. If we then sort of look at other options, so the cross trainer actually loads the forefoot quite a lot, but it takes out a lot of the impact. So this is a little bit hitty-missy, really. A really useful tool because it does bias the calf, but actually if you do too much of it, you can get caught out. And that's the same with a stepper, really. Really useful way, much like the Jacob's ladder, to actually load that athlete from a calf perspective, but without... but with bias onto that soleus. So if we think about the knee itself, anything above sort of 60 degrees is going to load massively the soleus instead of the gastroc. And that is a really important part when we look at rehab. So during rehab, the athlete may well present with symptoms. So what is acceptable? What do we need to really keep a close eye on? And what is unacceptable, really? So there's a lot more evidence available in the literature regarding tendons. And that sort of range that they're happy with is that sort of 0 to 3 out of 10. So when you ask the athlete, how painful is it on that VAS or numerical pain rating? If they're 0 to 3, we're fairly happy and comfortable. Now, if it's a gastroc, what you're probably going to get is that they get little sharp pains that occur. Now, that's normally a bit of a clue for them and for you, and they're not happy pushing through that. And again, that sharp pain might be sort of 6 out of 10 plus. Contrast to that is the soleus. So the soleus, again, it can grumble around that 0 to 3. And actually, you may well be upsetting or interfering with that normal sort of scar development. And actually, if it is starting to get up to a 4 or a 5 on that soleus, it's a real worrier that actually it's not a very happy environment for that soleus. And you may need to back off a little bit with your load. Now, 2 really important things for me with rehab is the repeatability. So whatever you've done in rehab, before we get into it, is whatever that content of that session is, the athlete should feel like they can re-perform that the next day. If they can't, then the likelihood is that you've overloaded that and actually you may need to build in more recovery or look at really adapting the amount of load that you're applying to that athlete. It might be the volume, it might be the speed, it might be various other elements. I know one other thing with an author that I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce, but I'll probably get it wrong, is that sort of monitoring. So a really good clue, again, is that 1 to 2 hours post-training, how does it feel? And you can also couple that with sort of how it feels the following morning. So if they're waking up and they're sort of hobbling around a bit, or they've got any symptoms on walking in particular alone, those things are real clues to me that I've actually done too much with this athlete. The athlete should always be able to walk pain-free and almost symptom-free, really, during the rehab process. So this is your more traditional sort of surfing of the rehab curves. It's sometimes put here. And basically what you normally do is go through a fairly steady process where we are looking at sort of building the athlete up. This is me just sort of playing around on this surf machine. And actually, as we introduce more variables into the mix, we're trying to improve the sort of the speed at which we're exposing things at. Now, if you apply that with everyone, it's going to happen the same as it happened here. You're going to veer off course and feel like you are constantly trying to battle. So it's really important. You've got your gastroc approach and you've got your Soleus approach. So more information on that, really. So if you've got 2 different surfers, you've got 2 different waves that you need to run. So if you've got a gastroc, you need to surf the gastroc wave. And what that looks like, if we look at the graph on the left-hand side there, the green line that's there, it's quite a linear build-up. So we might do some work offloading the athlete and then building them up in the gym. We may just incrementally build that load exposure on the pitch or on a treadmill from a running perspective. And it's fairly uniform. And it's also quicker than your Soleus. Now, this isn't time scale based at all, but it's mainly just to sort of emphasize the point. But your gym-based time with a Soleus tear, for me, is considerably higher. And the other thing that I just wanted to highlight from this graph is almost that instead of going to that sort of low-level plodding that you sometimes do with a calf, maybe a gastroc can get away with it because you've got that Soleus that's got its back and it's taking a lot of that force absorption. What you actually end up with a Soleus is actually what you may want to do is just reduce the plodding around a pitch, that sort of just go for a warm-up lap. Because even doing that, sometimes athletes don't even make it round and you end up sort of pulling your hair out. That's probably why I've got no hair. Why that athlete is just suddenly tightening up incredibly just by doing a plod. And then you almost feel like, oh, they're not ready to do anything. But you might need to drip them in at a higher speed. So, for example, this would be the worst sort of a possible thing, really, that you may well do with a Soleus, is almost that super slow running. So you might have a really sort of quick, fast twitch athlete who you then have, you're telling them to run slower. And actually what they look like is horrendous. And they then end up sort of with an increased ground contact time. And actually what ends up happening is you end up with issues because you're asking that athlete to move in a different way. Whereas actually it might actually be a lot safer to build that athlete up, make them really dynamic, get their plyos done in the gym, and then drop them into their running at a higher level. And this just highlights it again. So if we look back at the sort of theory of the Soleus, again, this is probably where the little bromance and admiration for your Soleus has come from, really, that recognition that although it's sort of a bit of a silent hero, really, it absorbs a whole lot more load and generates so much more force than your Gastrocnemius. So I think that's why it's commonly underloaded during that rehab process. So you can see the Soleus there, it's probably 3 times the amount of force that your Gastrocnemius can create at those different running speeds. So speeds just along the bottom there for reference. So really important, really. So if you've got a Gastrocnemius versus a Soleus, you need to pick the amount of load that you're aiming for. And these are just a few little guides, really. So your gastroc, you might not need to go up to sort of beyond sort of 1.5 times body weight, really. Your Soleus, though, might well even go sort of 5 times body weight. If you don't address that, then these sorts of things can happen where you just go the wheels fall off and you end up getting re-injured again if that load hasn't been developed. If it's not that, that time it might be in another area. So with that athlete that I was talking about who really likes a high speed, actually in hindsight, it was probably because his soleus strength wasn't good enough that he then started to develop some real patellar tendon problems. And actually it might be that lack of absorption and forced development of the soleus that didn't allow for that absorption. And then he was sort of overloading quads and patellar tendon above there. And the other markers on here just give you a little bit of a clue regarding the body weight of the athlete. So depending on what athlete you've got in front of you, these are some of the markers that we look at. So what do we need really to know in terms of building the athlete up? So we have to know how much load is roughly going through the calf with different exercises. Otherwise, it makes it very difficult to progress that athlete on. So this is your more traditional eccentric loading program, isn't it, really? So if we have your Alfredson program, really, that we had, that sort of very progressive eccentric loading program, 3 lots of 15 of both extended knee and bent knee exercises twice a day, really time consuming. But actually, again, sort of what I was alluding to earlier on, some of your other research that's gone out there, that much heavier load, you don't need to do anywhere near as much in terms of volume, and you can still get the same sort of benefits, really. So if we look from sort of left to right there, again, this is sort of the easiest thing to do, really, either with weight above you or a backpack on or whatever it may be. You're going from the ground up into a calf raised position. You don't get any dorsiflexion, really. The floor will stop you at plantar. So if that is one of your aims, good place to start. If you want to build that up, you might want to put them on a step and actually put a little blocker there, something like a weights plate, just so they have a little tactile limit, really, that they go to. You might want to build that athlete up again into a sort of single leg position. If you're going heavy, I really like the box position, in that sort of hip lock position with one side, and you're working that back leg. You can do the opposite, so you could be loading the front leg and keeping the back leg straight. And then obviously we've got sort of single leg through full range right into that dorsiflexed outer range terminal position where some of those calf and Achilles issues occur. Now, something that we don't usually see enough of, in my opinion, is your sort of soleus loading. So we need to go beyond 60 degrees. So this is a nice sort of wall squat position, working on double leg calf raising. Massive bias onto the soleus. Probably not heavy enough, but not a bad place to start. You can go split stance, or you can even go into sort of a single leg position. This is quite a demanding exercise, and it might be that you need some stability from sort of a wall or something for them to hold on to during it. Again, should be really slow. This is probably a little bit too quick. If they aren't recruiting from glute, or they're collapsing, that sort of corkscrewing motion, this is quite a nice way just to reintroduce that. So get the glute firing, get your pelvic control and that sort of Trendelenburg reduced, and go from there. Then we've obviously got sort of lunge positions, this sort of split stance where we've got the athlete lifting up single leg on that front leg. You can add load onto the front of the leg if needs be, add little dumbbells, whatever you need to, really, or do that sort of rear foot supported. Now, this might be a regression or it might be a progression if you are, depending on how much load you've got on there. So you can go into a seated sort of Smith press, again, work off the steps so you've got full range, and you can either go double leg or you can go single leg. And again, vary the amount of time that they're performing that for, try and make it replicate what they may be doing in their sport. If we look on the right-hand side now, so this is one of our athletes, again, using that sort of very heavy loading strategy on that rear leg. So they're going up into a sort of a calf raise, massive bias on the gastroc on the back leg. If they do the opposite leg, so they're actually lifting up from their foot that's on that platform, then again, the focus will all be on that sort of soleus. So you can, again, load it really nicely in that position in quite a nice, safe way. Other alternatives, so you have this hamstring curl machine. So again, you can sort of adapt equipment that you find in a common gym to actually suit your athlete accordingly. So you might want to do double leg versions, single leg progressions. You might do isometrics here, you might do concentrics, and then again, just it might be that you go much slower than this with some of that sort of eccentric loading. On the right-hand side, we've just introduced sort of a decline angle at whatever angle you want to work on. So you can use 1 or 2. And again, that just works into that terminal sort of dorsiflex position where some of those issues can occur. Now, the other thing that's really worth noting is only working on the vertical propulsion of your calf isn't enough for running athletes. We need to build them up in a forward momentum, really. So you can see this is happening with the athlete here. So she's using the prowler and she's just doing prowler walks, and she can build in some knee drive or hip lock positions. And again, it starts to prepare the athlete quite nicely for that build into more than just walking. They can then actually start to do some quite quick footwork drills with that. So they're really looking at that sort of stickability. So they're not looking for distance. And then you can do the opposite, where they're actually doing some little sprints with the prowler, and look at how that builds up and translates very quickly into a running drill position. Things to look at in terms of focus, we need to get the stiffness, so that heel's not dropping. How much ground contact time is there, and what's that sort of forward drive like? We can do that in different planes. So to prepare for athletes who are multi-directional, going backwards, again, focus on that posterior chain, the hamstring and calf complexes. Again, stick with the same cues. They want to reduce the amount of time that they are spending in contact with the ground and loading through that region. So a few different other ways to build that up. So we may be looking again at the stickability, using the wall as a bit of a support mechanism. So we can build that up just doing knee drives, one side to the other, get them confident and get them used to going through that process. And then we can do like a rocked calf raise, so we're actually going through full range. So we're stepping back. The working foot is actually the left foot. And again, you've got that nice hip lock position that the athlete will likely end up getting at that later phase during running. You can use something like a foam roller just to get a little bit more of an uneven surface and get the motion a little bit more dynamic. And again, that stickability at the end, looking at the amount of height that they have there, really important. You can do some drops. So it might be that, again, you're starting to just build that athlete up, introducing some different variables there. To progress on, really what we can do is some swaps. So we're just looking again at making sure that we stick, so there's not a heel drop there. You can see here there's a slight little give on the left-hand side compared to the right. If that's too tough, you can narrow that down and make the steps smaller, so you're not lifting as high. And you can step back to get more of that propulsion effect. So again, a really nice little option for that sort of running athlete. You can do alternate, so you can do 1, 2, 3s. So you're doing alternate sides. Similarly to before, you might find that actually there's issues in that sort of lumbar pelvic region, and using external cues like a Swiss ball are really helpful for a lot of athletes, because what you're aiming to do is almost tighten the left glute up to, as shown here, to then enable that athlete to drive forward without any hip internal rotation or sort of collapse, ideally through that sort of mid-foot region. So what you try as a cue really to do is almost as you contract, that ball should raise about 1 centimeter. You can do that again in different planes. This is just to show you. But as you lift up with that, again, you can sort of see as you go through the motions with that, you're trying to maintain that glute control. And again, you can just do that with calf bias, as shown there. You can do that with the front foot, the foot that's in a hip lock position. You can put that up against the wall almost to mimic the position that maybe sort of a hamstring tear would occur in, where the hip's 90 and knees extended if needs be. This next video is just me discussing really some of the ways that you can maybe engage that tib post. So if you see that the foot is lacking control, this may be a little cue that you need to work on with that athlete.
So if you want to start to turn your tib post control work into something a little bit more functional and weight bearing, this is quite a nice position to start. So you're going to pop the band around your calcaneus. You're going to take it up almost as high as you can towards almost over that sort of talus region. Now that's going to pull your heels together. What I want you to do is almost fight against that position. And then from this inner arch, is almost imagine you've got a hook that is pulling up. So you're almost trying to create more activation through that arch there. The other cue that we sometimes give is almost drawing that big toe backwards towards you, but you're really trying to lift that medial arch from that position to try and activate and maintain a neutral foot position and not allow that sort of pes planus, that overpronated position to occur. So once you're holding that position, again, that in itself is quite a nice exercise. If you want to then progress that, you could go into more of a calf raised position, so go on double leg, and then slowly back down again. And right the way through the range, monitor what's happening with the alignment of the Achilles to make sure that there's no increased angulation that might suggest that you're starting to get some tilt through there. And then again, come back up into that calf raised position, look after the control, and then back down again. If you want to progress that further, you can almost do your windscreen wipers in that position. So you're going to lift up on both feet, and then you're going to actually pull your heels apart, and then slowly let them come back together again, and then go out again, and back in again, and then slowly come down. And again, lift up into that plantar flex loaded position. Allow those heels to fan out, back in again, and then slowly back down again. And that is a really nice way to start to really work that tib post, and you'll start to feel a burn anywhere around that sort of medial malleolus and through that tendon as that tib post comes up. That will fatigue, it might become a bit domsy because it probably hasn't been used a great deal leading up to this. So give that a go. That will hopefully give you a little bit more control around that mid and rear foot and maintain that neutral position of that foot in a functional setting.
So there you go. So if we then look at building up the single leg exposure, so this hip lock position is really important for running athletes. So we can start that off the floor. We can also do that off a step. So we're encouraging that end range dorsiflexion control really from there. So if you are doing it in this way, again, it is more gastroc biased using the rear leg. If you are using the leg that is on the step itself, and again, you can have that hanging off the edge of the step if you want to, so you're actually lifting with the foot on the box, the bias is all on that soleus because your hip position is around that sort of 90-degree mark, along with that sort of knee flexed position. Now, this isn't necessarily something that you do early, but just while we're showing it, these are some of the sort of ways you could develop that. So you've got as much offload as you want from your hands. And again, you're looking at sort of any of the sort of little plyometric drills at reduced body weight. So you can take as much weight as you want over the bar or between tricep dip bars and see how we build that up. The bouncing backwards and forward is actually quite a risk-reward thing later on because you're mimicking really sometimes the mechanism that athlete has injured their calf in. So that eccentric end of range terminal dorsiflexion plus that knee extension is a very typical way that gastrocnemius tends to be torn. So if we just look at the different sprinter variations again, so this is how you may well just build that athlete up. So you start in single leg and then with a flat foot, and then using your body momentum to take you through. The next phase on from there is to then do some slow swaps. And again, we're really focusing on the stick that we've got. So we're making sure that that loading through the forefoot occurs and they aren't dropping through that heel. Look for any asymmetries that there may be at foot, ankle, or pelvis. And then really it's just a case of building up the speed at which this athlete is performing those. And then we have the variations. So little quick feet, and then adopting that normal triple extension at the stance leg and that hip lock position on the other. So triple extension is key with these. So that hip extension, knee extension, ankle extension. And again, you can build that up accordingly. So this isn't just sort of a theoretical thing. This is how it may look with athletes that we've worked with in the past. So this athlete, again, doing his 1, 2, 3s. And you can also approach the wall from distance and then build in some of your stick work there. This next one is sort of a up to 10. So if we have a look at how quick this athlete is, again, we're looking at that nice controlled element, but building up the speed. This might well form part of your sort of squad dynamic. So it might be an injury prevention thing. And again, looking at different planes of motion that you work in, again, really important parts of loading that athlete. So that is basically the early to moderate sort of stage loading process. So this is the sort of half-time mark, if you like. This is only half of building the athlete into their program. There is all the sort of ways that we build the athlete into running and their sport in the second half. But really, take-homes from this side of things is that early loading is actually really important for the athlete. That doesn't mean going out and running. That means exposing the tissue to an acceptable load that they can tolerate without any sort of form of reaction. For example, if you start loading at day 2, versus day 9, there are some real implications in terms of how long that athlete will take to return to sport. You may need to modify things that you're doing to enable that process to occur. And things like active recovery are key words that we would use in sort of professional sport to make sure that we address maybe some other secondary issues, but actually also not just resting is rarely an option, and you're never going to ask that athlete to stop everything that they're doing. You should be able to adapt everything to enable yourself to either load the tissue itself if it's appropriate, or certainly work on all the other streams that may well sort of help protect that that particular tissue. Stiffness is key, so that calf and tendon stiffness, really important to get that neuromuscular control element that's there, reduce the body weight as you need to enable that stick factor. So all the things that we showed you with the sort of offloading in pools, in alter Gs, on reformers, or even just plonking yourself in between some sort of tricep dip bars. Again, however you can do it, get that good quality stickability and stiffness in that tendon. The education is key. So as you take the athlete through their journey, really, really important to make sure that they are aware as to how long it's going to take that athlete to progress, and also what we're using to monitor how well they are progressing. The athlete may well have some misbeliefs or some fear avoidance strategies that are going on. They may not load that calf that's maybe been torn because they're worried about it. But actually, the more that you reinstall load and expose that athlete to an acceptable load, their confidence will grow, and they're less likely to have sort of secondary injuries from overloading a different part of their body. The failed rehab options certainly seem to be the ones that haven't been exposed to enough load or under enough for enough time, or almost sort of replicated the demands of that sport. All of that will be discussed in the second part, really. So that late stage calf rehab and the preparation phase is really, really important. That's the bit that often gets missed. So people do this bit reasonably well. It's the next bit that really you need to get right, where we get the plyos all involved as well.
So congratulations. So that's the first half done. No brainer. Your next stage is really just to go on and do the late stage and return. And if you're watching this in isolation, again, these are the sorts of learning opportunities that we have at growphysio.com. Loads of information on social media. So jump online, get some follows going, make some comments, really enjoy sort of going through the process with people. So do get in touch with us. And I'll hopefully see you in the second part.
Perfect. So yeah, that's brilliant. Thanks for that, Steve. Got a few questions in, so we'll get going with a few of those. So starting off, Steve, would you prefer athletes to perform rehab exercises with shoes on or shoes off?
Good question. So I think it varies depending on what the athlete is like. So obviously with shoes off, quite a lot of the times I do that, and you sort of see this actually in the Achilles rehab process as well with the case study there. We actually wanted to increase the amount of sensory input into that foot, and almost when we were working on some of the loading strategies and where that athlete was sort of stressing, if you like, to try and get that normal windlass mechanism, we found that he performed a little bit better early doors with some of that sort of dynamic ISO work with his shoes off. And sometimes we actually got that athlete onto the pitch and went through some stuff there. Again, we were working on a 4G artificial surface, so it was a little bit unique, but actually it almost increased the amount of sort of sensory input with them. Obviously from that, I guess the subsequent question may be something like sort of barefoot running, and I'm probably going to sit on the fence with that. I haven't done it. I haven't been exposed to enough of it really, or trialed it. There's far too much sort of risk reward in a professional environment really, that if you start to introduce brand new things with people in the season, for me, it's not something that I've addressed. So I'll probably sit on the fence on that one.
Perfect. So next question is, Steve, can you elaborate on the point you made regarding the patellar tendon and quadriceps when returning from soleus issue compensation?
Yeah, sure. So I think if we think about the absorption streams and what muscles are really important in terms of absorption. So when we run, we obviously have your absorption stream and your force generation stream that we talk about. So that triple extension position versus that sort of hip lock position and that absorption side of things really. So this is speculation. It is not a guarantee because we never know. But with this athlete, he had a soleus issue and had some recurrent calf problems. And basically what he found was whether, and it's probably a question for us really as a department, did we necessarily expose that athlete to enough soleus demand load specific to running to enable them to make sure that they weren't compensating elsewhere? So this athlete then developed some patellar tendon issues a few months down the line. And again, you're just thinking about why has that occurred? And again, it's not a guarantee, but a thought process that did we not address the absorption side of the soleus? So then that kicked everything higher up the chain. And then there was maybe more demand through that quad.
Perfect. So there's quite a few questions flying in now. So so one's from Chris. When loading the movements, would you be changing the foot position to target specific areas of the gastrocnemius throughout the rehab process, or just within the early and mid phase?
Yeah, so I think probably if you're trying to do that in the later phases, you probably want to move from those sort of intrinsic sort of cues that you're working to some of those more extrinsic things. So early doors, I think it's a really good point. You may want to alter the angulation like we showed you on that sort of hack squat machine, where we've maybe got the foot at say 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, whatever angle it is, we'll maybe stress that medial or lateral aspect of that gastroc a little bit more. I think early doors, that is something that I would address. So you may want to deload, say, the medial gastroc, which is the more commonly injured side of things proximally, by almost altering the angle. So you bias the lateral side. But alternative to that, you might actually want to stimulate that side and encourage load onto that injured side if they are maybe have some fear avoidance elements and all the psychological bits that sort of buy into that athlete. If they've had an injury, they may not want to load through it. but you need to restore that, and that's really important in that early to sort of mid stage, really, that you get that foundation right, because I think the major risk is people watch your Instagrams and all these sexy bits of rehab really that look amazing, but actually if you haven't got that foundation there, you are guaranteed to get mixed results. And the likelihood is even if you don't get a recurrence of that injury in the calf, you may get something that's going on elsewhere as a secondary problem.
Perfect. And another one from Lucy. So what outcomes are you looking for in the rehab before moving the athlete onto the next exercise and back into running for both Soleus and Gastro?
Yeah, so I mean, that is it's all in the next stage of this, really. So that sort of mid to late stage, and then reintegrating the athlete back into there. So it's got all the markers in there. And you want to address all the elements of obviously the strength, the stiffness that we talk about. So that ability for that athlete to maintain that stickability, and obviously achieving some of those body weight related goals and targets. So that's not just the vertical propulsion bit, it's also that sort of horizontal or sort of forward momentum that you get, really, because I think that most people do the vertical aspect all right, to be fair, and then it tends to be that as they try to transition into running, you're almost asking a completely different demand from that calf, that you've got the forward propulsive element. So again, all of that is in the second part, really, and it's probably far too in-depth to go through now, but certainly the little clues during the sprinter rehab drills that you saw on the wall there is obviously making sure that you've got the stickability that's there. And then when you've got your Soleus, is making sure that in a controlled environment that you've got enough load going through it.
Cool. And there's a few on blood flow restriction. So would you use blood flow restriction rehab with quad injuries, or just find them helpful in the lower leg?
You can definitely get benefits anywhere in lower limb with them. I think I tended to use them mainly for sort of that lower leg issue, because it just enables you to put load through there, to be honest. Again, I'm not an expert in blood flow occlusion. I'm sure there's tons of research that sort of suggest and give a much better guidance in the different protocols, really, that are associated with that.
Perfect. And another one from Lucy, actually. So you may have actually touched upon this a second ago, but when would you integrate the sprinters and wall work with a Soleus versus Gastro injury?
Sure. So I think it depends entirely on the athlete and the injury that they have. It's that whole thing. It's when they're ready to progress. And I think that's the key element with it. So you're going to gradually, incrementally build up that rehab bit by bit, and you're going to expose that athlete and the tissue to different stresses. Now, we haven't even touched upon any of the multi-directional elements of this, which again comes in that second part, but you are going to need to just build up, and again, use the little monitoring things that I talk about. So how sore is it during? How sore is it afterwards? Do they have any pain the following day? Are they aware of anything on walking? And they're the little clues. Other things that are a really good clue is if when they're going upstairs, are they experiencing pain? Because although that's an isometric load almost through the calf itself, again, that's another really big indicator for me that you've probably overloaded that tissue. So unfortunately, I can't give timescales on it. It varies on the grade. It depends on what the tissue is, whether it's Gastro, Soleus. But again, look for all those little clues that I've talked about through there that may indicate that you've upset the sort of almost the healthiness of that and how that tear is progressing.
And then one from Helen. So how do you feel about calf compression socks for prevention of calf injuries or part of rehab?
So yeah, I mean, I typically quite like some extra input proprioceptively. I don't think that can really offer anything negative. I think if it's restricting or altering the biomechanics of that athlete, then obviously it is potentially detrimental and a negative thing. But for me, I think a lot of my athletes through rehab, if we are building up and introducing new stimulus that are maybe sort of slightly higher risk, or certainly some increased load or some increased speed, I quite like the first time using something that's going to give them a little bit more stimulus. Certainly with sort of the Achilles ruptures, they quite enjoy the fact that they've got an additional bit of stimulus and compression there. It probably won't make any difference in terms of if you expose them to that injury position, that really high load eccentric dorsiflexion, and add in that sort of knee extension side of things. It's probably not going to stop that if that is at a load that is excessive for that tissue, but it will, I think it only helps give you a little bit more proprioceptive input really. And obviously we'll aim to take them away bit by bit, but the first few times you do it, I don't see any harm in that at all.
Perfect. And one from Matt Hobson. So from a sports massage therapy standpoint, depending on the tear level, would you integrate deep tissue rehab and loading therapy, or prefer one over the other in the early stages?
I think we've got to be a little bit careful with getting into the tissue too early. So certainly in that initial sort of 48 hours where there's a bleed and you've got a very fragile sort of healing site, really, the likelihood of stirring that up is excessive for me. I steer pretty clear of any sort of soft tissue input really in the early days. It might be from that sort of day 3, 4, you start to almost do some of the sort of really light effleurage bits and pieces where you're just almost trying to nudge a bit of that inflammatory stuff out of there. Obviously calves, ankles, stuff lower limb wise around there. If there's any fluid there, majority of the time we're standing or sitting, so it doesn't get a great chance to sort of get flushed away. So again, I'd normally almost have them prone with that knee flex, so you're almost then encouraging a bit more flow as well. But yeah, I wouldn't be getting into any sort of deep tissue work around that injury site at all. And I think your objective markers really will gradually restore themselves later on down the line anyway. And if they're not, then you may need to go in there and either address the joints. And that's anything really from that sort of big toe all the way through to the sort of ankle, and then looking at the sort of local soft tissue elements as well. But I wouldn't ever go sort of near a tear site. You can maybe get away with working around it. Maybe some of your little ART techniques away from the site. But yeah, that probably sums it up.
Brilliant. I'm conscious of time and the amount of questions, so let's do a couple more and then we'll wrap it up. So Chris has said on using the Swiss ball for glute activation, is there a slight lean into the ball?
So yeah, so basically what you want to try and do with that, just to sort of cast your mind back. So if you find that you have an athlete who is maybe dropping a little bit through that pelvis, so they have some almost contralateral drop, what you almost want to do is slightly nudge into the ball, but then fire that outer glute. So what you're actually getting is, rather than just pushing into the ball, you're also trying to elevate it by say 1 centimeter or 2. And that as a little sort of external cue for some people really helps them. The only thing you've got to be aware of with that is making sure they're not just hip hitching. And if they are hip hitching, obviously they will just end up a little bit tight through the sort of soft tissues, sort of all those paraspinals and things that are around there, your QLs and what have you. So just make sure that if they are achieving that level pelvis or slightly higher, then again, it needs to just be addressed that you are activating from the outer glute rather than hitching on that sort of swing leg, if you like.
Cool. And then one from Clive. So is there a risk when creating the stiffness and controlling the heel drop? Is there a liability to shorten the tendon?
Well, I think what we have to address with that really is just thinking about the function bit. So clearly what we do is make sure we worked into the ranges that the injury will occur. So normally, as I've said, that sort of knee extension plus the controlled work into that terminal dorsiflexion range, we have to work there. And again, some of the early stage stuff with the isometric work in particular, and almost going from that sort of mid to almost inner sort of outer range, really, that has to be a focus. But for me, when it gets to the point where you're starting to load that athlete and expose different speeds, they need to be able to get that stickability and that stiffness through there. So we aren't sacrificing range of motion at all, and making sure that we aren't just working in that range. You could sort of see a lot of the work dropping off a step, so you're getting the strength and at really high levels in that outer range. But certainly for that drill on a wall sprinter, you need to get that stiffness.
Perfect. Okay. And then, so I know we mentioned before in the first presentation, did you give a bit of advice for people who are out there trying to make a career or even quite far in their career. But what advice now would you have for people in the current climate and wanting to push forward in their career?
Yeah, and it's a real challenge, and I'm sort of getting a lot of sort of comms through from people, particularly on sort of LinkedIn scenarios and things, just saying, can I do placements with you? There's no options to do it. Is there any sort of possibility of growing opportunities? And I think this has been a bit of a journey for me, really. And I think putting together courses that you can access on here. So this, to be fair, shamelessly in some ways, but actually I think it's a brilliant platform that people can actually access at this time. So we actually have the beauty of introducing people to course-related learning at growphysio.com. So rather than just doing sporadic talks here, there, and everywhere, at least this will take you through the theory, how to assess that joint or soft tissue, then all the manual therapy, the strapping bits and all the adjuncts that we use, and then obviously the sort of rehabilitation side of things, and then looking at how that whole process marries up together with either a clinical reasoning session that's on there where we take you through all the imaging and things, and then also obviously with players. That's probably about as good as we can probably offer at the moment. And I'm delighted, to be honest, from a personal perspective, that the hours are actually counting towards a lot of the official university placement hours. And I've got my 2 students coming in a couple of weeks. I'm dead excited about that. Had a couple of people ask from sports therapy worlds, can we use the hours? I've said it comes with, all of the sessions come with CPD certificates on the website, but you do need to obviously ask your universities whether or not that they recognise that. Worcester has done, because of the fact that I've got my master's, I've done my MACP, I've got my clinical mentorship accreditation. So they are, but again, check with your sort of universities or governing bodies and things to make sure that that can count. I think aside from that, obviously what I said last time for anyone who tuned in was make sure that when things open up, you marry yourself up with someone who is almost going to give you that support and nourishment and allow you a little bit of extra rope so you can actually try some of your ideas and apply them, really. And I think it's a real shame that we can very rarely offer that in a pro sport environment. But this is probably about as good as you can almost offer in this environment, which is exactly why I set it up, really.
Yeah, brilliant. And yeah, I think we'll leave that. Again, there's so many questions coming through and so much positive feedback for this. The chat box is full of positive comments. So it looks like it's gone down really well with everybody. So that's great news. If you've got questions that weren't answered, or you want to check out obviously Grow Physio stuff, obviously all the details are on the screen there. And then we've got our webinar again next week with Dave Hancock, which I mentioned earlier, and Steve's actually joining us on that as well to sort of bounce ideas from off with Dave as well. So we'll put all the communications out from that. But just a huge thank you to everybody for getting involved and the questions and the comments, and Steve for giving up the time and putting this presentation on.
Brilliant. A massive thank you from me, guys, as well. Take care of yourselves, and hopefully any questions, do get in touch. And yeah, feel free to use the platform. It's £1 to use, so crack on.
Brilliant. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Take care.